friends and neighbors. Welcome to another in the series of Socialism in the Park, presentations on socialist theory and current affairs. My name is Barry Weisletter. I'm Federal Secretary of Socialist Action, one of the editors of Socialist Action newspaper, which you've all probably been invited to purchase several times since you arrived here today. It won't stop, believe me. You have to get one. Last week, we began our exploration of the basic tenets of socialism by looking at the origins of class and the state. Mitchell Shore gave a presentation, but today you're in for a real treat because we come right down into the 20th and 21st century. We're going to explain how things happened in the 20th century and in this century, try to make sense of the world, provide some tools of analysis so we can deal with the phenomenon about which we read so much, but so little is explained in the popular press, in school, or anywhere else. After the presentation on permanent revolution, Stalinism, and the transitional program, there will be some announcements, and then open dialogue, questions and contributions from the floor and answers from the front if you pose questions. So that's how it's going to work this evening, and welcome to all of you. It's so nice to see that you came out despite the shower, but the shower is over, the sun is out, and we're going to have a great time here this evening. So the speaker for tonight is one of the leaders of Socialist Action. Julius Arscott is also an elected member of the Executive Board of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. We in Socialist Action contest elections in our unions, in the NDP, and in other working class organizations. We think that if there's going to be change in the society, we need to fight for socialist leadership in the main organizations of our class. So that's our approach, and he's an example of how we can advance socialist ideas, if I say so myself. Pretty good example. So Julius, what is permanent revolution, Stalinism, and the transitional program all about?
Some people are going to listen to those questions and think, what the hell are you even talking about? So several people, well, a lot of people ask us some questions about, well, what's the deal with what you're trying to do? Why are there so many different groups on the left? Why are there divisions on the left? And what are the reasons for it? And what do you propose to do moving forward? So I'm going to go into a lot of history that explains why a lot of these developments, a lot of these differences and developments that have taken place, which have been a result of experience that have actually happened. So the outbreak of World War I showed conclusively that capitalism has entered into a period of decline. Enormous material destruction and horrendous human suffering was unleashed. This was repeated through the 20th and 21st centuries, which, the Great Depression, numerous recessions, colonial wars, destruction of the ecological balance. Humanity is today faced with a stark choice, socialism or barbarism. When war broke out in 1914, the reformist or social democratic parties of what is called the Socialist International capitulated to the wave of chauvinism and to the ruling class of each big power. The big powers being Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Turkey, United States. But the contradictions of social patriotism soon erupted. When revolutions finally broke out, the social democratic leaders, who had given their approval to the massacre of millions of soldiers for the cause of capitalist profit, quickly rediscovered their pacifism. Then they begged the workers not to use violence to overthrow the system. While the Socialist International fell to pieces, a handful of revolutionary socialists remained faithful to proletarian, or what we would call workers' internationalism. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, Monod and Rosmer in France, Lenin, a section of the Bolsheviks, Trotsky, Martov in Russia, the SDP in Netherlands, John McClain in Great Britain, Eugene Debs in the US, some of you might have heard of that name before, and the majority of the social democratic parties in Italy, Serbia, and Bulgaria. The internationalists regrouped first at the Zimmerwald Conference in 1915 and then at Keinthal in 1916. Lenin predicted a large-scale revolutionary crisis that would bring the radical left to the forefront, and he was quite correct. The Russian Revolution broke out in March 1917. In November 1918, revolution broke out in Germany and Austro-Hungary. In 1919-20, a huge revolutionary upsurge shook Italy. At this point, the internationalists fought for socialist revolution, and the social patriots became counter-revolutionaries, loyal to the state and to capitalism. In March 1917, the Tsar's autocracy fell due to hunger riots and the decomposition of the army. The situation was falling apart for the ruling class. While the 1905 revolution had failed because of the inability of the workers' movement to link with the peasant movement, this alliance was proved fatal for Tsarism in 1917. The working class played the major role in March 1917, but it lacked a revolutionary leadership, and so was robbed of victory. The power taken from Tsarism was put in the hands of a provisional government, or a coalition of bourgeois or ruling class parties, like the Cadets was the name of one of them, and moderate labor parties, the Mensheviks, and socialist revolutionaries. But the mass movement was so strong that it had its own structures, councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants, delegates backed up by the armed Red Guards. Thus, from March onward, Russia was in a situation of dual power. The provisional government was based on a decomposing bourgeois state apparatus. Opposing to it was a network of Soviets, or workers' peasants' councils, progressively constructing a workers' state power. Trotsky's prediction in 1905 that Russia's future revolution would see the blossoming of thousands of Soviets was confirmed. The right wing of Russian and international Marxism believed that Russia, being a backward country, needed a bourgeois revolution like those in the 18th and 19th centuries. And remember that. What would this entail? The overthrow of absolutism, the winning of democratic rights, freeing the peasants from semi-feudal chains, the liberation of oppressed nationalities, the creation of a unified market to facilitate the rapid growth of industrial capitalism, which would prepare the way for a future socialist revolution. From this was derived the strategy of an alliance between the liberal bourgeoisie and the workers' movement. The latter forced to limit itself to the fight for the 8-hour day, the right to organize and to strike, etc. So Lenin rejected this strategy in 1905. He recalled that Marx had said after the revolutions of 1848 that once the proletariat appeared on the political scene, the bourgeoisie went over to the camp of counter-revolution out of fear of workers' power. So Lenin proposed an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. But Lenin conceived of the democratic dictatorship of workers and peasants as being based upon a capitalist economy and state. As early as 1905-1906, Trotsky pointed to the weaknesses of this idea. He pointed to the chronic inability of the peasantry to constitute an independent political force throughout history. The peasantry has, in the end, always followed a bourgeois or proletarian leadership. With the bourgeoisie getting or going to the right, the fate of the revolution depends on the ability of the proletariat to win political hegemony over the peasant movement and establish an alliance between the workers and peasants under its own leadership. In other words, the Russian Revolution could win and fulfill its tasks only if the proletariat could conquer political power and establish a worker state, backed up by an alliance with the poor peasants. So the theory of something called permanent revolution proclaims that in the imperialist period, the so-called national or liberal bourgeoisie in underdeveloped countries is subordinate to foreign imperialism and to the old ruling classes. The tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution can be realized only by the dictatorship of the proletariat or working class power, backed up by the poor peasants. In other words, only a worker state could achieve agrarian revolution, national independence, democratic freedoms, and industrial development, which of course was lacking in Russia at that time. Trotsky's prediction in 1906 was entirely confirmed by the course of the Russian Revolution in 1917 and by the revolutions in underdeveloped countries since then. When Lenin returned to Russia from abroad in spring 1917, he saw the immense revolutionary possibilities. With his April thesis, he changed the direction of the Bolshevik Party along the lines of permanent revolution. Some old Bolshevik leaders, including Stalin, Kamenev, and Molotov, resisted. They urged unity with the Mensheviks and critical support for the provisional government. But the Bolshevik Party, under the pressure of vanguard workers, combined with Trotsky's followers, adopted the perspective of permanent revolution and won a majority amongst the working masses. After the premature July uprising and the unsuccessful counter-revolutionary push by General Kornilov in August, the Bolsheviks won the majority of the Soviets in the large towns. From September onwards. In November, the Petrograd Military Revolutionary Committee, under the leadership of Trotsky, seized power and handed it to the Soviets. The old state and the provisional government collapsed. In the workers' insurrection, violence was minimal. The first workers' state was born. The immediate tasks of the revolution were peace, land for the peasants, putting an end to national oppression, and extending Soviet power across vast Russia. But the bourgeoisie set about to sabotage these policies. The workers, now aware of their strength, would not tolerate this. So what began as workers' control and privately owned firms rapidly passed over into nationalization of the banks, the big factories, and the transport system. Except for peasant and small artisan implements, the major means of production were now in the hands of the people. Still, Russia was a backward country. The Bolsheviks were counting on a revolution in the industrialized West, especially in Germany and Italy, which would have created a strong basis for building a classless society. Unfortunately, the German and Italian revolutions did not succeed. This was largely due to the counter-revolutionary role played by the Social Democrats. So, isolated, the Russian Revolution, led by Lenin and Trotsky, did the best it could with the available political and material resources that it had. Now, Soviet Russia was torn by civil war. The former landowners and Tsarist officers tried to overthrow the first workers' and peasant republic by force. The SPD in Germany tried all manner of promises and lies to turn the workers away from the struggle for power, even pledging to nationalize big industry. Nosk called in the Freikorps to beat up leftists, and they were actually responsible for killing Rosa Luxemburg. The Freikorps were the nucleus of the future Nazi armed bands. The new communist parties, which founded the Third International, lacked experience and made many errors. The bourgeoisie, fearful of revolution, granted concessions to the workers, including an 8-hour workday and universal suffrage. In the year 1923, it was a turning point. The KPD won a majority in large trade unions. It formed coalition governments in Saxony and Thuringia. But the KPD was badly advised by the Comintern and failed to systemically organize an armed insurrection at the most favorable moment. Big business regained the initiative, stabilized the currency, and brought a bourgeois coalition back into power. The revolutionary crisis was over. Now, Soviet Russia won the Civil War in 1921, but it was exhausted. Production had fallen drastically, famine gripped the country. To remedy the situation, while waiting for a new rise in the international revolution, Lenin and Trotsky embarked on an economic retreat. So big industry would remain publicly owned, but the free market was reestablished for the agricultural surpluses after state taxes. This was the NEP. It was a temporary retreat to stimulate production, and the petit bourgeois enriched themselves. But a far bigger problem resulted from Russia's backwardness, and it began to take hold. The proletariat was weakened by the drop in industrial production and the exodus into the countryside. It was partly depoliticized by famine and hardship. Many of its best elements were killed in the Civil War. Those who survived were absorbed into the Soviet apparatus, and since the state in this period could not train enough qualified personnel from the working class, the bourgeois intelligentsia tended to retain the monopoly of knowledge, and the great poverty favored the defense of material privilege. In 1920, the workers' opposition within the Soviet CP sounded the alarm. In 1921, Lenin called the Russian state a bureaucratically deformed workers' state. In 1923, the Trotskyist left opposition was formed, with the fight against the bureaucracy as one of its main priorities. The left opposition called for accelerating the industrialization of Russia, raising wages, increasing democracy in the Soviets and in the party, providing assistance to poor peasants, and raising taxes on rich peasants, and reinforcing the perspective of world revolution, including by rectifying errors of the Comintern. This was a program that could have rescued the Russian Revolution. Unfortunately, the majority of the leaders understood too late that the threat contained in the rise of the bureaucracy. This explains the victory of Stalinism in the USSR. The bureaucracy is not a new class. It is a privileged layer of the working class which usurped power in the Soviet state and economy and used this monopoly of power to grant itself consumer advantages like higher wages, fringe benefits, special shops, etc. But it did not own what we call the means of production. Its power rested in the gains of the November Socialist Revolution, public ownership, planned economy, state monopoly of foreign trade. It was conservative. Like every bureaucracy, it put self-preservation above extension of the revolution. It feared world revolution would revive the political activity of the Soviet proletariat and thus undermine its own power. So the bureaucracy favored the international status quo. It resists the re-establishment of capitalism, but only to a point. So we saw in 1989 when the USSR bureaucracy split. Some of them are now capitalists, which got rich by plundering the social wealth of Russia. The USSR was not a socialist society, that is, a classless society. It was a society in transition between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism was restored by means of social counter-revolution. The direct power of the workers could have been restored, but only through a political revolution which could break the bureaucrats' monopoly over the exercise of power. The label capitalist did not apply to the Soviet economy because it was a system where producers were dominated by bureaucrats, not private owners. Capitalism is a specific system of class domination. It is characterized by private ownership of the means of production, competition, generalized commodity production, the transformation of labor power into a commodity, the necessity to sell commodities before the surplus value contained in them can be realized, and the inevitability of periodic crisis of generalized overproduction, which is the crisis of capitalism. None of these could be found in the Soviet economy. Neither was the Soviet economy socialist, which implies a regime of associated producers who themselves regulate their productive and social life, and which is defined by the disappearance of commodity production. The USSR was far from that, regardless of the claims of the Soviet bureaucracy. The anti-Marxist theory propagated by Joseph Stalin that socialism could be built in one country was simply a crude attempt to justify the bureaucracy and its actions. In opposing socialism in one country, Trotsky and the left opposition did not defend a defeatist position. They were the first to advocate rapid industrialization, the defense of the USSR against imperialism, the defense of the gains of the revolution against any attempts to restore capitalism in the USSR. But they understood that the fate of the USSR depended on the class struggle at the international level. This remains true today for the surviving worker states for healthy revolutionary Cuba. So then, what is Stalinism? Khrushchev called it a cult of personality, but this subjective psychological explanation is shallow and incompatible with Marxism. Stalinism is the expression of the bureaucratic degeneration of the first worker state, where a privileged social layer usurped power. The forms of brutal repression, police terror, the purges, assassinations, the Moscow trials, can vary, but the main features are constant. Workers' democracy is suppressed in favor of rule by a despotic bureaucracy. In the capitalist world, Stalinism signifies the subordination by the parties which followed the Kremlin of the interests of the socialist revolution in their own countries by the interests of the Soviet diplomacy. It debases Marxist theory into an instrument to justify every tactical turn of the Kremlin and the Stalinist parties. Now, Stalinist tactics have contributed massively to many huge defeats. And when a lot of people hear about socialism, the first idea or image that comes into their mind is Stalin, or Stalin's caricature of what Lenin is. The coming to power of Hitler in 1933, the defeat of the Spanish Revolution in 1939, the disarming of the French and Italian communist masses, and the construction of the capitalist state and economy in 1944-46, the bloody crushing of the revolutionary movement in Iraq, Indonesia, Brazil, Chile, and many other countries since then. The Stalinist tactics of class collaboration with liberals in the Boss state and in the so-called Popular Front did not help the USSR. They represented the narrow interests of the bureaucracy, and they undermined workers' interests everywhere, and the very existence of the USSR. Now, I just wanted to make a bit of a side note, because we're talking about a lot of different political ideas, and while the idea of fascism is a topic unto itself, I want to make clear that fascism is a mass movement of petty bourgeois reaction caused by capitalism in extreme crisis and supported by capital as a last resort to smash the threat of revolution by an insurgent working class. There's a common idea out there that socialism and fascism are the same thing, but they're not. Although I hear the Canadian anthem somewhere. What's going on? Trotsky pioneered this analysis. You can Google Trotsky or fascism if you want to find out more. So the crime of Stalinism and socialist democracy in the 1930s is that they refused to form a united front to resist and smash the fascists. Instead, the KPD said that the Social Dems were social fascists, which is equivalent to the Hitler Party. The KPD actually said after the Nazis take power, it would then be the turn of the KPD to rule. And the Social Dems weren't much better. By the 1940s, the USSR ceased to be an underdeveloped country. A new rise of world revolution led to the emergence of new worker states in Yugoslavia, China, Vietnam, and Cuba, and radicalization of youth in Western Europe and the Americas. Under these conditions, opposition tendencies arose and splits within the Stalinist bureaucracy occurred, such as the Stalin-Tito rupture in 1948, the October-November 1956 uprising in Hungary, the Prague Spring in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and revolts in Poland in the 1950s and later. Now, after Stalin's death, a series of reforms were implemented in agriculture and industry, but these are limited in their effect by the continuing stranglehold of the bureaucracy. Without democratic and public control by the mass of producers and consumers, it is impossible to achieve truly rational and efficient production that also meets the desires of the population. Each bureaucratic reform tends to substitute a new form of bureaucratic abuse and waste. Greater autonomy of factory managers, combined with technological delays and overcommitments to military expenditures, resulted in a general stagnation in the 1970s that doomed the USSR. The victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949 broke the capitalist encirclement of the USSR, stimulated the process of permanent revolution in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and put imperialism on the defensive. This occurred because in practice, the Maoist leadership broke with the Stalinist line of the bloc of four classes and revolution by stages. It led a vast peasant uprising and destroyed the bourgeois state. However, the Chinese Revolution was bureaucratically deformed from the outset. The independent activity of the working class was restricted. Forms of bureaucratic privilege, imitating Soviet Russia, were widespread. Mao tried to channel growing mass discontent by launching the so-called Cultural Revolution. Has anyone here ever heard of that term, Cultural Revolution?
Yep.
The Cultural Revolution of 1964-65, but this was essentially a campaign to purge of Mao's enemies in the Communist Party apparatus. When the Red Guards became critical of the entire bureaucracy, they were dissolved. The Sino-Soviet split reflected the Chinese Communist Party's rejection of monolithic control by Moscow, which was justified. But the narrow nationalism employed on both sides of the dispute, later duplicated in the China-Vietnam split, dealt a severe blow to the international workers' movement and gave imperialism more space to maneuver. Maoism is a more flexible, eclectic offshoot of original Stalinism in Russia. Its characterization of the USSR as social imperialism served to justify all the turns in Chinese foreign policy, including the alliance with the bourgeoisie in various countries in a so-called struggle for independence for the two superpowers. It substitutes Maoist ideology for fundamental class distinctions. It rejects workers' democracy, it rejects the united front, and it justifies the use of violence and repression within the workers' movement. Behind a veneer of mass participation, it paved the way to capitalist restoration in China today. So since World War I, the objective conditions for building a socialist society have existed. The world division of labor and the interdependence of peoples reached a high level. The numerical strength of the working class and the economic basis for transforming the world economy is present. Political conditions necessary for revolution, including growing divisions within the bourgeoisie, its inability to rule, and growing rebellion against the system by workers, have given or risen periodically in various countries. Lacking, however, were adequate subjective conditions. These include the level of class consciousness of the proletariat, its degree of maturity, and the strength of its revolutionary leadership, that is, its revolutionary party. Therefore, the lack of revolutionary victories, particularly in the West, has been essentially a function of the crisis of leadership in the working class. This analysis, based on the historic failures of reformism and Stalinism, led Trotsky and opposition communists in 1933 to begin creating a new revolutionary leadership for the world working class. In 1938, they established the Fourth International for this purpose. The FI is not yet a mass workers' organization international, but it is able to transmit, sharpen, and improve the program needed by the world working class to its constant activities within the class struggle in dozens of countries. The FI tries to train leaders based on this theory and practice. It tries to unify the experiences and consciousness of revolutionaries on a world scale, teaching them to build a single world organization instead of vainly waiting for spontaneous unity to occur. So the construction of new revolutionary parties and a new international combines the defense of the Marxist program, which brings together all of the lessons of past class struggles, with a current action program that integrates what Trotsky called a program of transitional demands. Socialists intervene in mass struggles to bring the participants through their experience to acceptance of the action program, and to give forms of organization to these struggles, which will teach them to create workers' councils during revolutionary crisis. The need for a revolutionary international was a material basis: world economy, world politics, and world wars. Imperialism is a global system. Production is global. The great problems of humanity can be resolved only on a world scale. It is utopian to proceed on any other basis. To put off the creation of a real mass revolutionary international and member revolutionary parties in each country is to lag behind the objective need for our times and the advanced section of the masses themselves. So what is the distinction between immediate demands and transitional demands? By themselves, working people generally do not go beyond the formulation of the most immediate aims: higher wages, shorter hours, basic democratic freedoms, etc. These are demands that the bourgeoisie can grant to prevent struggle from threatening capitalism as a whole. Besides, higher wages can be neutralized by higher prices, and short hours can be countered by stepping up the pace of work. The state can raise taxes to force workers to pay for social gains that they win. To break this vicious cycle, working people must be won to the adoption of transitional demands. Demands which are increasingly incompatible with the normal functioning of the capitalist economy and state. Transitional demands must be easily understood, while at the same time unleash a challenge to the system and promote self-organization of the masses. Examples include, for a sliding scale of wages and hours, open the books, and the demand for workers' control. The transitional program also also addresses the reality of the three sectors of the world revolution today. In the semi-colonial countries, workers must support every anti-imperialist mass movement, whether it is aimed against foreign domination, for a peasant revolution, or for the elimination of a local bloody dictatorship. Having won the leadership of the mass movement, the proletariat fights for the conquest of power. It seeks to overthrow both the foreign and native bourgeoisie. This is a strategy of permanent revolution. In the bureaucratized worker states, we fight for democratic freedoms, against corruption, against the reappearance of national oppression, and demand the running of the worker state by the workers themselves, organized in councils with a plurality of parties, free debate in the media, and a democratically planned economy through democratically centralized workers' councils. This is a strategy of the political anti-bureaucratic revolution. In the imperialist countries, the mass movements confront capitalist exploitation and the suppression of democratic freedoms. The fight for a new revolutionary leadership leads to the overthrow of capital and its state, and towards collective ownership of the means of production and socialist planning. This is a strategy of the social revolution and of the proletariat. The different paths of workers and revolutionaries around the world reflect the uneven and combined development of the world revolution. This revolution does not break out simultaneously in all countries. The supreme task of revolutionary socialists is the progressive unification of all revolutionary processes into one. This unification is possible because one social class is capable of advancing it elsewhere and everywhere. This unification will take place thanks to the internationalist politics and education of the revolutionary vanguard, which will increasingly bring to bear experiences of international solidarity, and which will systemically fight racism, sexism, heterosexism, and national chauvinism. The direct action of the masses through strikes and other mobilizations raises their level of consciousness through the growth of confidence in themselves. In daily life, workers, poor peasants, small artisans, women, youth, national and racial minorities are accustomed to being crushed, exploited, and oppressed. They tend to feel that revolt is useless, that their enemies are too strong. But in the heat of great struggles, these feelings of inferiority begin to disappear. Ordinary people become aware of their immense potential power as soon as they take collective action. That is why revolutionary Marxists attach extreme importance to everything that increases the self-confidence of the masses and helps to break them from servile behavior. For that reason, we emphasize democratic assemblies of striking elected strike committees, and every similar mechanism and other forms of mass action. In learning to conduct our own struggles today, we learn how to run the state and the economy for tomorrow. Unity in action is crucial as well, because unity cannot be achieved without practicing the widest possible workers' democracy. Unity means non-exclusion of any current that participates in the struggle, and freedom of expression within the struggle. It also means minorities should respect majority decisions, knowing they will have an opportunity to modify decisions in the light of experience, and through further debates and votes. So I'll conclude with just two more points. Firstly, as an example of the application of the method of the transitional program to conditions in the Canadian state today, I refer you to the booklet Prospects of Socialism in Canada, which we have. Barry, I don't know if you have a copy with you, but we have some at the table. And to the action platform for a workers' agenda on pages 20 and 21. This is supplemented by the demands presented on page 26. You will also find it useful to read the Manifesto for a Socialist Canada, which is another booklet that we have over there, the platform for the NDP Socialist Caucus. Secondly, I strongly suggest that a revolutionary program incorporating transitional, democratic, and defensive demands is of little use without a democratic, centralist revolutionary organization that educates, agitates, and organizes for its realization. I invite everyone here who wants to fight for a better world to take the most important step forward that you can in that direction and join socialist action today. Thank you. So I know that I just did a very many people would think would be a very theoretical presentation, and a lot of the language that was used might be difficult, or you might not have ever heard it before. There's others here who are familiar with the terminology, so we're going to open the floor up to any questions or comments. Don't feel like that because you don't know what some of the language is that you don't have a right to ask any questions. This is an open forum for everyone. Okay.
But first, a few announcements. Is this working?
Yep.
A few announcements. You still with me? How you doing? Okay. By the way, we have some delicious vegan pizza on the corner picnic table. So thank you very much for Jackie bringing the vegan pizza. So if you haven't got a slice yet, just meander over there and grab yourself a slice. Tonight's presentation is the second of 3 parts, Socialism in the Park. So we'll be here again next Wednesday, same time, same place. And the topic is Socialism in Canada, an introduction to basic socialist ideas. So it'll be very concrete ideas in that talk. Julius mentioned some literature that's on the display table, just over there under the colorful pavilion. So one of them is Prospects for Socialism in Canada. I'm pushing this one because I was one of the authors. No shame, no blame. Tonight's presentation is based in part on this booklet, The Death, Agony of Capitalism and Tasks of the Fourth International, the Transitional Program. So you can pick up a copy of that. Some of these are available online as well, because I know a lot of people don't relate to paper anymore, do you? And an essential reading is this Statement of Principles, Socialist Action, which is the platform of our party. So it explains what issues and proposals